On a crisp winter morning, the city seemed to hum with life. Among the bustling streets, a high-end restaurant stood with its spotless glass doors reflecting the golden rays of the sun. Inside, an air of sophistication enveloped the establishment. Patrons, dressed in their finest attire, sipped coffee and exchanged quiet laughter. Waiters moved with practiced grace, balancing trays laden with exquisite meals. Every detail spoke of affluence and exclusivity. The doors swung open, letting in a sharp gust of the cold morning air. A man stepped inside, his presence incongruous with the luxurious surroundings. His coat, though neatly buttoned, was old and frayed at the edges. His shoes bore the wear of countless miles, their soles slightly scuffed. Yet there was something dignified about his bearing. He moved with deliberate steps, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. The lines on his face hinted at a life filled with experiences that few could imagine. His eyes, deep and steady, held a quiet strength that seemed to defy the judgments awaiting him. From across the room, James Thornton, the restaurant's manager, noticed him immediately. James prided himself on maintaining the establishment's reputation as an exclusive sanctuary for the elite. His trained eye, accustomed to assessing guests within moments, lingered on the man's attire. A wave of disdain crossed his face, subtle yet unmistakable. The frown forming on his lips betrayed his thoughts. James approached with brisk steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. As he neared the man, his posture stiffened, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Excuse me," he began, his voice low but cold. "This isn't the sort of place for loitering. We serve paying customers only." The man turned to face James, his expression calm and unreadable. "I'd like to see the menu," he said, his voice soft yet steady. James's frown deepened. He glanced around the room, aware of the other patrons watching. Some looked curious, while others deliberately averted their eyes, choosing to remain silent. The tension in the air grew palpable. James cleared his throat and gestured toward the door. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said firmly. "I'll have to ask you to leave." For a moment, the man remained still, his eyes searching James's face. Then, with a slight nod, he said, "I see. Thank you." His voice carried no bitterness, only an unexpected grace. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps unhurried. As the door closed behind him, a murmur arose from a nearby table. A young man leaned toward his companion, his eyes wide with recognition. "Wait," he whispered, "isn't that Elijah Carter?" But the door had already shut, leaving the room to wrestle with an unease that lingered long after the man had gone. The morning buzzed with activity inside the pristine restaurant. Elegant chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished marble floors. Crystal glasses clinked softly as waiters moved seamlessly between tables. Conversations hummed quietly among the affluent patrons who sipped espresso and savored perfectly plated breakfasts. Everything about the establishment exuded luxury, and its manager, James Thornton, took pride in preserving that image. From behind the counter, James spotted the man who had just entered. His posture straightened, and his professional smile faded slightly. The man stood just inside the doorway, glancing around. His coat, though buttoned neatly, bore the unmistakable signs of wear. His shoes, scuffed and dulled, seemed misplaced against the shine of the floor. Yet his demeanor was calm, his gaze steady, as though he belonged despite the unspoken judgments swirling around him. James's initial glance turned into a full appraisal, his frown deepening. The tension in his shoulders became visible as he stepped forward, weaving through the neatly arranged tables toward the man. The quiet hum of conversation began to fade as nearby diners noticed his movements. When James reached him, he didn't bother with a welcoming tone. Instead, his voice was clipped, his words precise. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his eyes fixed on the man's coat. "This isn't a place for loitering. We serve paying customers only." The man turned to face him, his expression calm. He didn't flinch or seem offended. His reply was measured and polite, his voice steady. "I'd like to see the menu." For a moment, James hesitated, but only long enough to process the request. The crease in his brow deepened, and his gaze shifted briefly to the other patrons who were now watching the interaction more openly. Feeling their eyes, James escalated, his tone sharpening. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said firmly. "I'll have to ask you to leave." The man held his gaze. His eyes were not angry, nor did they plead for understanding. They simply reflected a quiet depth, as though he had weathered moments far more difficult than this. Finally, he nodded, his voice soft but clear. "I see. Thank you." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His steps were unhurried, and his back remained straight. The air seemed heavier with his departure. As the door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room lingered, amplified by the silence that followed. It was broken only by a hushed voice from a nearby table. A young man leaned toward his companion, his eyes wide with recognition. "Wait," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the clinking of cutlery. "Isn't that Elijah Carter?" The name rippled through the room like a spark igniting dry wood. A faint buzz of whispers and murmurs began, blending with the soft clicks of phones being unlocked and screens lighting up. Articles, photos, and headlines popped up on searches as patrons quietly shared their findings. "Elijah Carter," someone whispered. "The philanthropist?" "The self-made millionaire," added another, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He owns half the buildings in this district." James remained rooted to the spot, his face pale, as the realization washed over him. His gaze darted toward the door as if expecting the man to return, but the door remained firmly shut, and the memory of his dismissal weighed heavier with each passing second. The patrons exchanged knowing glances, and the whispers grew softer, yet their judgment lingered in the air, hanging over James like an unspoken rebuke. Despite the polished walls and sparkling glass, the restaurant suddenly felt much smaller, its once pristine image now marred by the ungracious treatment of a man whose worth extended far beyond appearances. James swallowed hard, his pride and professionalism now battling the embarrassment creeping over him. In that moment, he wasn't the poised manager of a high-end establishment. He was merely a man who had made an unforgivable mistake. The buzz of the restaurant had barely returned to its usual rhythm when a sharp voice cut through the air, stopping conversations mid-sentence. A younger customer, seated near the center of the room, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished marble floor. His face was a mixture of shock and disbelief as he turned to the staff, his voice rising with incredulity. "Do you know who you just kicked out?" he demanded, his tone loud enough to carry across the restaurant. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the space as the room collectively leaned in, eager to catch the unfolding drama. "That's Elijah Carter." The name hung in the air, met with confused expressions at first. Then, like a spark igniting a flame, recognition spread among the patrons. The murmurs started softly, but quickly grew louder as more people reached for their phones, curiosity compelling them to confirm what they had just heard. Fingers swiped rapidly across screens, typing in the name that had just been spoken. Moments later, gasps and murmurs filled the room as articles and images appeared. Elijah Carter. One woman whispered to her companion, her tone tinged with awe. The philanthropist? The one who donated millions to the children's hospital? Another patron chimed in, holding up his phone to show a picture. He's the owner of Carter Enterprises. The man's a self-made millionaire. He built half the properties in this district. Tables buzzed with whispered conversations, each voice carrying the weight of revelation. The elegant, polished restaurant suddenly felt like a courtroom, with judgment falling heavily on those who had dismissed the man just moments ago. The focus shifted to the manager, James Thornton, who stood frozen near the door, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. James's mind raced, trying to process the situation. The realization hit him like a wave, and with it came the overwhelming sting of embarrassment. His stomach churned as he remembered his sharp tone, his dismissive words, and the calm dignity with which the man, Elijah Carter, had responded. Panic set in, tightening his chest and making it hard to breathe. I didn't know," James stammered, his voice barely audible. He turned to the staff nearest him, his movements frantic and disjointed. "Why didn't anyone tell me? I mean, how was I supposed to know?" But his excuses fell flat in the weighty silence that followed. The patrons weren't looking for reasons. They were silently condemning his actions. The stark contrast between Elijah Carter's humility and James's hasty judgment was impossible to ignore. The younger customer who had spoken up earlier folded his arms, his expression one of disappointment. "You didn't bother to find out," the customer said pointedly. "You looked at him and assumed." James swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked around the room, hoping for some semblance of support, but found none. The realization sank in further as he saw the disapproving glances from the very clientele he had worked so hard to impress. The tables, once filled with idle chatter, were now abuzz with murmurs of indignation. One of the waiters hesitantly approached James, his voice low but insistent. "Should we call Mr. Carter back, sir? Maybe apologize?" James nodded quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. Yes, of course. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. We'll comp his meal. Whatever he wants. Just fix it." But the damage was done. Even as James barked out frantic instructions, it was clear the moment couldn't be undone. The door through which Elijah Carter had walked out remained shut, and with it, the opportunity for redemption seemed to fade. In that room, filled with wealthy patrons, the real lesson wasn't about money or status. It was about respect, dignity, and the cost of prejudice. As James stood there, his polished demeanor now cracked, he realized the depth of his mistake. No amount of frantic damage control could erase the memory of what had happened. And no one would forget the man who walked out with his dignity intact, leaving behind a room full of people forced to confront their own judgments. The restaurant buzzed with an uneasy energy long after Elijah Carter had left. The polished ambiance, so carefully curated to exude elegance, now felt tainted. Whispers rippled through the tables, the patrons unable to shake the realization of what had transpired. The manager, James Thornton, spent those hours pacing, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. His chest tightened every time he glanced toward the door, a gnawing guilt eating at him. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the door opened. Elijah Carter stepped back inside. This time, the room seemed to hold its breath. The once dismissive figure who had been ushered out with condescension now commanded an undeniable presence. He hadn't changed his appearance. His tailored suit remained pristine, his posture still carried the quiet dignity of a man who knew his worth. Yet, it was the storm of emotions in the room that transformed the moment. Patrons who had whispered behind their screens now sat stiffly, guilt written across their faces. All eyes turned toward Elijah. James froze, his stomach twisting as he saw the man he had so poorly judged walk toward him. The manager, who prided himself on composure, now felt his professionalism slipping. He rushed forward, words spilling out in a frantic attempt at apology. "Mr. Carter, James faltered, swallowing hard before continuing. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" Elijah held up a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The calm in his eyes was far more piercing than any raised voice could have been. "You didn't mean to what?" Elijah said, his voice steady but edged with undeniable power. "Judge me by my skin, by my clothes, or assume my worth because I didn't fit your idea of what belongs here?" The words cut through the air, slicing through James's feeble excuses. The room, once filled with murmurs, now descended into silence. Elijah's gaze swept across the tables, taking in the patrons who had chosen to stay silent earlier. His presence seemed to fill every corner of the room as he stepped forward, addressing not just James, but everyone present. "The problem," Elijah continued, his voice calm but commanding, "isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought you already did. You looked at me and decided in an instant that I didn't belong, and you didn't need to know my name to do it." A shiver ran through the room. James's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at Elijah, his eyes wide with remorse. But he knew there was nothing he could say to undo what had been done. Elijah turned, his gaze now resting on the diners. "How many of you saw what happened and said nothing? You watched a man be humiliated because it didn't concern you. But prejudice isn't just about the actions of one person. It's about the silence of many." The weight of his words pressed heavily on everyone present. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others lowered their eyes. Elijah's calm voice carried more power than any raised tone ever could. James finally found his voice, shaky but sincere. "Mr. Carter, I made a terrible mistake. I can't begin to express how deeply I regret my actions." Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the manager. "Regret is a start," he said after a pause. "But change is the next step. How will you ensure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone who walks through that door?" James nodded quickly, the gravity of Elijah's words sinking in. "I'll make changes," he said earnestly. "I promise. Training, policies, anything necessary." Elijah's eyes softened just slightly. "Good," he said simply, "because this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this place truly reflects the values it claims to uphold." He turned once more, his presence leaving a lingering weight in the room. As he walked toward the door, the patrons sat in stunned silence, each left to wrestle with their own complicity. Elijah exited the restaurant with the same quiet dignity he had shown before. But this time, he left behind a lesson that no one in that room would soon forget. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts and headlines calling out the restaurant's discriminatory actions. The once prestigious establishment found itself at the center of a PR nightmare. Regular patrons canceled reservations, while activists called for boycotts. The restaurant's reputation, carefully built over years, crumbled in days. James Thornton, the manager whose judgmental actions had triggered the uproar, bore the brunt of the consequences. The restaurant's ownership, desperate to salvage their name, announced his dismissal. His position was quickly filled by someone who not only valued professionalism, but also understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. The message was clear. Such behavior would not be tolerated again. While the world expected Elijah Carter to take legal action or publicly denounce the restaurant, his response was nothing short of remarkable. Instead of seeking revenge, Elijah chose a path of grace. He announced that he would fund a new community initiative aimed at providing equality training for businesses. The program would focus on educating staff on the importance of inclusion and respect, ensuring that no one would endure the humiliation he had faced. Elijah's act of compassion resonated deeply, shifting the narrative from one of outrage to one of hope and change. His initiative became a symbol of progress, sparking conversations and inspiring other businesses to adopt similar practices. Through his actions, Elijah transformed a painful experience into a catalyst for justice and growth, proving that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in the power to foster understanding and equality for all. Elijah stepped out of the restaurant, his head held high, his presence commanding respect far greater than any material wealth could buy. The quiet dignity with which he carried himself spoke volumes, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. A bystander, watching him walk away, turned to their companion and murmured thoughtfully, "Some people show their wealth with money. He shows it with character." The moment lingered, heavy with the weight of the lesson learned. Inside the restaurant, patrons sat in contemplative silence, their perspectives forever changed by the grace and wisdom of a man they had so hastily judged. As the story came to a close, its moral resonated like an echo. Never judge a person by their appearance. True wealth lies not in possessions, but in the kindness, respect, and humanity we extend to one another.